Hello and welcome to this video, building on the concept of isomers. In short, isomers relate to the structure and combination of elements in a molecule. As was mentioned in the overview, sugars are a common and convenient example of isomers. Sugar isomers are important in brewing, and that is what this video will explain. Let's begin with glucose as an example. Why glucose, you may wonder? Well, that is simple. It is one of, if not the most common brewing sugars, and it neatly encompasses the topic at hand. Glucose is also known as dextrose and corn sugar. Glucose has the formula C6H12O6. This is the same formula used for a large number of other sugars, and more broadly compounds. It is in the context of this action, which is called isomeration, that brewing and sugars have an interesting crossover. Let's look further into why glucose is an interesting example of this at work. Glucose is biologically active in both the alpha and beta forms. This is accompanied by a weird chemical reaction, in which the alpha form fluctuates with the beta form to reach an equilibrium. This means that even if you took one of these out of solution in entirety, the remaining form of the sugar would change and return to a balance between the alternate forms. Alpha-glucose chains make starch. The alpha-glucose subunit in this chain is compressed into the cyclical form. This is structured in such a way that the yeast invertase, and for that matter most species which have an endogenous invertase, can break the carbon ring apart. Part of this owes to how the alpha form creates bonds. By attaching to the first and fourth carbon, this leads to a coil that has the glucose evenly separated by an oxygen bond. This is much like trying to fit a playing card between gaps in a brick wall which has no mortar. There is ample room for the card to get through, and this is why the invertase can reach this oxygen bond. Beta chains of glucose are a bit different. That is, they form cellulose and not starch. This cellulose is a sheet more than a coil, and the oxygen bond is tightly held between the glucose molecules. Think of it as trying to fit a playing card between two bricks that do have mortar. The invertase is unable to access the oxygen molecule in this case. You can test the difference between the two by adding iodine to the cellulose and starch. The starch will hold onto the iodine, but the cellulose will not. This can be done using a potato and a piece of paper. The paper is made from cellulose, whilst the potato is filled with starch. The invertases are an important part of sugar metabolism, and work by accessing the oxygen molecule and hydrolyzing it. This breaks up the long starch chain, but cannot break up the cellulose. There are more details on yeast metabolism of sugar linked in the top right. This is why sugar will make you fat, but grass will not, the inability of the invertase to work on this bond. The next important thing to look at here is that yeast will only metabolize the D form of glucose, but not the mirror alternative, which is the L-glucose molecule. L-glucose is not a naturally occurring sugar, but can be generated through the use of enzymes. Only the D-glucose form is biologically active. It is also the only naturally occurring sugar, and as such, for the purposes of brewing, it is the only relevant form of glucose. We next need to look at the linear and cyclical forms of these sugars. The format of glucose and the associated isomers is split between a cyclical or ring shape and a linear or straight line. Both of these are made from carbon and the hydroxyl groups hang from them. This is headed on one end by a double bonded oxygen and carbon, which is called the carbonyl group. To make the ring, the carbonyl group loses the double bond with the oxygen, and this is then held by a single electron bond. When you begin brewing, this ring form will be the most common, as it is structurally and chemically stable. This most often leads to a ring made from 6 carbons, but occasionally it creates a 5-carbon ring, and the last carbon molecule is positioned out of this ring. The rule still generally remains a 6-carbon ring, but you should be aware of the exception. There are a total of 7 glucose isomers, which are found in living organisms. These include the most common, glucose, galactose, and mannose. These are also the most relevant. The exact sugar does not affect yeast metabolism in this case, if it is a D-isomer. Glucose, galactose, and mannose can all be fermented. For this reason, the compatibility does not change between them, despite the fact that they are all variations on the same basic molecule. This could perhaps be best attributed to both an evolutionary advantage in diversity and an evolutionary selection for being able to work with all of these related but slightly different sugars. Now for why this is important when brewing. Beyond the obvious implications of isomers in what you brew with, and aging, there are points to be made about how it affects the steps taken and efficacy. All of the isomers that have been described so far are able to be metabolized by yeast to an extent. This is possible under both aerobic and anaerobic conditions. If you want to get the most out of brewing, certain actions are needed, especially for starch chains. In the case of beer and whiskey, heating of the barley and malt is necessary. This helps to gelatinize the starch granules. This further breaks up the bonds between glucose molecules. These broken chains can be more effectively acted on by enzymes when gelatinized, and this helps glucose be converted into energy and alcohol. This same process does not work on cellulose, because of the structure described earlier. However, once you begin aging your brew, the cellulose in the wood barrel does break down slightly. This leads to production of vanillin flavors. This occurs because of the extended exposure of the cellulose to both water and fluctuations in temperature and chemical composition of the brew. The slight reactivity of the brew helps to break down, and in order to break down, it then creates an equilibrium with the brew itself. The aging process overall helps to reduce the reactivity of the chemistry of your brew, but in doing so it comes at the slight expense of the wood barrel cellulose content. When discussing the variety of sugars used in brewing, there is relevance to the preferential fermentation of the sugars. For example, glucose is very easily fermented, and it will often be the first to be metabolized. Maltose is just 2 glucose molecules that are stuck together, and they'll need to be split. And then you have sucrose, which is a fructose and glucose molecule, which also need to be broken up, and a little more work is then needed on the fructose molecule. This complexity goes all the way up to a starch chain. That will need a lot of work to get the glucose free. This is one reason why a recipe will call for ratios of certain sugars. It accounts for the difficulty in accessing the glucose within it, and also the preferential fermentation. Further to this, by being similar in configuration, some sugars will inhibit the metabolism of others. This can be important if you want to brew a very fast and dirty wash, or if you are given a very specific recipe. You may not be able to use substitution as easily in that case, because of that competitive inhibition. The same structure, or a similar one, can take the place of the intended target, and in this case, glucose might be blocked by a maltose molecule. As a final point, assuming price and other factors were not an issue, and you were to add artificially created L-glucose to your brew, it would be very sweet. It would never add alcohol to your brew, despite being a sugar. This is because it was not biologically active. This is also largely true of other L-form isomers. This has been a very simple video providing some preliminary information on what sugars are and how they relate to isomers, and builds on the recent video. Although focusing on glucose, the lessons to a certain extent can be applied to other kinds of sugars. For example, fructose. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.